Hello guys, close your eyes and imagine yourself in a faraway time, in a dark, whispering forest. The air is cool and damp. High above, a canopy of ancient trees sways gently in a late summer breeze. It is early in the year 9, during the reign of Emperor Augustus, and you find yourself deep in the heart of Germania. The light is soft and grey, filtered through endless layers of leaves. Beneath your feet, a narrow dirt path winds through the dense woods, its earth turned to mud by days of rain. In the distance, you hear faint rumbles of thunder. Droplets of water bead on the ferns and mossy logs around you. In this calm moment, take a slow breath. Allow the scene to unfold in your mind's eye. You are surrounded by Roman soldiers marching slowly, wearily, one foot after another in the muck. The gentle clinking of armor and the shuffle of many feet blend with the patter of rain on leaves. The smell of wet soil and wood smoke lingers in the air. You might notice how heavy your own armor feels on your shoulders, how the dampness has crept into your wool tunic underneath the breastplate. Yet you and the men around you press forward, deeper into the forest, unaware of the danger that is gathering silently among those trees. In this gentle story tonight, we will walk together through the events of the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, slowly, calmly, and with respect for the weary souls who trudged this path long ago. Before we continue, I want to softly remind you that if you enjoy falling asleep to these calm historical journeys, please consider giving this video a like and, if you haven't already, subscribing to the channel. Your support helps me to keep bringing you these peaceful, long-form history stories to help you relax and rest. Thank you so much for being here with me. Now, let's return to our gentle walk through the misty forests of ancient Germania. As you imagine yourself in this scene, try to picture the world as it was in those days. The Roman Empire is at its height, stretching across vast lands from the sun-baked deserts of Egypt to the foggy isles of Britain, and now reaching into the wild forests and rivers beyond the Rhine. The year is 9, just 9, so long ago that Britain has yet to be fully conquered, and the city of Rome is still ruled by its first emperor, Augustus. Augustus is an old man by now, a calm and calculating ruler who has brought years of peace and stability to the Roman world after decades of civil war. Part of his grand plan has been to push the empire's borders outward, to secure Rome's frontiers against any threat. And one of those frontiers lies here, along the great winding Rhine River, beyond which live the numerous Germanic tribes. For many years, the Romans and the Germanic peoples have known of each other, sometimes as trading partners, sometimes as enemies. Julius Caesar, over half a century earlier, had written about these fierce tribesmen across the Rhine, tall, hardy warriors who lived in forests and had no cities, who worshipped nature gods and loved freedom. Caesar even led Roman legions across the Rhine at times, building a massive timber bridge to span the wide river, only to show Rome's reach and then withdraw. Since those days, Rome's influence in this part of the world has slowly grown. Roman armies under Augustus's generals have campaigned deep into the lands the Romans called Germania, winning battles, building forts and roads, and even establishing a few trading settlements. The tribes, for their part, have been pushed and challenged, but they have not all been subdued. Still, in recent years, the relationship has seemed to calm. The Romans have been holding portions of Germania beyond the Rhine, not the whole land, but pockets here and there, in an attempt to gradually Romanize the region. Many of the local people have begun to adapt to Roman ways. Some villages host Roman markets now, where furs and amber are traded for Roman wine and iron tools. Some chieftains have realized that alliance with Rome can bring prestige and wealth. Treaties have been made, hostages exchanged, a customary practice where chiefs send their sons to be raised in Rome's sphere, partly as a guarantee of good behavior and partly to educate them in Roman customs. There is an air of uneasy peace in these forests, a sense that Rome's power is spreading quietly, and that one day this land too will be fully under Roman rule, just like Gaul to the west. Yet beneath that surface of calm, old feelings smolder. The Germanic tribes have a proud warrior culture and a long memory of independence. They prize their freedom, their libertas, as the Romans might call it, above almost anything. They remember their ancestors who roamed these forests freely, answerable to no foreign lord. Even as many of them enjoy the new goods and trinkets that Roman trade brings, they have not forgotten that they are being asked to bow to an outsider, to pay tribute, to follow Roman laws and accept a Roman governor. For a while, these tribes have been going along with the changes quietly, perhaps figuring they can gain from peace more than from war. But deep down, many resent the idea of becoming subjects to a faraway emperor. Now, consider the Roman perspective. Emperor Augustus has entrusted the pacification of this region to a man named Publius Quinctilius Varus. Varus is the Roman governor here in Germania. Who is Varus? Perhaps in the soft murmur of the rain you can imagine the figure of Varus riding along this column. He is in his late 40s, maybe around 50 years old, of patrician Roman blood in the flickers of imagination. See him as a dignified man with a stern face, wearing a general's cloak over his armor, possibly feeling a bit uncomfortable from the moisture soaking through. Varus is not primarily known as a brilliant battlefield commander. He is more of an administrator, a politician turned military leader. In his career, he has governed provinces for Augustus. Notably, he served in Africa and later in Syria. In those places, he showed himself to be a firm ruler, perhaps too firm. There are stories that in Syria he arrived as a man of modest means and left quite wealthy, leading some to whisper that he extorted riches from the local population. True or not, Varus has a reputation for being severe and demanding with subject peoples. Augustus trusted Varus enough to post him in this sensitive region of Germania, likely around the year 7 or 8. Varus's task here is part military and part civil. He is to protect the Roman interests and also transition these lands to Roman governance. Over the last couple of years, Varus has moved among different tribal areas with his army, enforcing Roman law, settling disputes, and crucially, collecting taxes and tribute. To the Roman mind, this is simply how empire works. New provinces pay their dues to Rome and, in return, get the benefits of Roman civilization and security. But imagine how that felt to the free tribesmen of the region. Taxes, tribute, these were alien concepts to many of them. Rome was treating them as if they were already conquered subjects. Varus, in his somewhat arrogant way, would issue orders to local chieftains as though they were subordinate officials. He would hold court and dispense Roman justice, perhaps punishing those who broke Roman laws even when local custom might have been different. In short, he behaved as though Germania were already a fully pacified province and its people essentially slaves or servants of Rome. This did not sit well with the Germanic nobility. Many tribal leaders outwardly went along with Varus's commands, but in their hearts they grew increasingly angry at the loss of autonomy. The common folk, too, who had enjoyed living by their own traditions, started chafing under the sudden expectation that they pay coin or goods to these foreign occupiers. Still, they did not openly rebel at first. The Romans had 3 whole legions stationed in their midst, thousands of well-armed, disciplined soldiers. There were also auxiliary troops, local men or men from other provinces serving Rome, and even some friendly Germanic troops attached to Varus's army. The tribes knew that to take on the Roman war machine in a straight fight was usually suicide. Rome's legions were virtually unbeatable in open battle, with their tight formations, armor, and combat engineering skills. So for the time being, they swallowed their resentment and waited. Now, among these Germanic leaders was a young nobleman of the Cherusci tribe who would change the course of history here. His name is Arminius. Let's pause and imagine Arminius for a moment. He is probably in his mid-20s, during that year 9, vigorous, intelligent, and ambitious. As a child or teenager, he had been exposed to the Romans early. In fact, Arminius had once been a sort of guest, some might say hostage, but in a relatively privileged sense, of the Romans. He spent time in Roman territory, possibly even in Rome itself, or in the provinces under Roman tutelage. He learned Latin, he studied Roman military tactics, and he earned the trust of important Roman commanders. By the time he reached adulthood, he'd been granted Roman citizenship and even a rank of equestrian, a minor nobility in the Roman system. He had served as an auxiliary officer in the Roman army, leading a unit of Germanic auxiliaries under Roman command in campaigns elsewhere. Perhaps he fought in the Balkans during a recent great revolt that the Romans suppressed. So Arminius had seen the power of Rome from within. He wore Roman armor, drank Roman wine, and dined with Roman officers. To Varus and other Romans, Arminius looked like a prime example of a civilized barbarian, a useful ally, someone who had come around to the Roman way of thinking and could help bring his own people in line. But human loyalties are complex. Underneath his Roman outer trappings, Arminius remained a Cheruscan, a son of the Germanic Forest. He never forgot his homeland, and he keenly felt what Roman domination would mean for his tribe's future. Perhaps he was genuinely torn at one point. After all, he had friends and a life on the Roman side, and he had benefited personally from Rome's trust. Yet, the tug of love for one's own people can be very strong. Arminius saw that once the current relative calm solidified into full Roman rule, the independent way of life of the tribes would be gone forever. Their warriors would be subject to foreign law, their freedoms curtailed, their own chiefs reduced to pawns of an emperor far away. So at some point, quietly, Arminius made a fateful decision. He would turn against Rome. Over time, Arminius began to organize a conspiracy. In secret council around fire-lit longhouses and forest clearings, he met with other tribal leaders who were likewise discontent. The Cherusci were joined by neighboring tribes like the Marsi, the Bructeri, the Chatti, and others of the region, warriors and chieftains who normally might feud with each other, but who now found common cause. They saw an opportunity. While Rome had many legions, at that very moment its forces were stretched. A massive military campaign had just ended. Far to the south, a rebellion in the Balkans had tied up legions for years until in the same year 9 it was finally crushed by Rome's great general Tiberius, Augustus's stepson. Many of Rome's best troops were still busy or recuperating from that costly fight. Here in Germania, Varus had 3 legions. These were numbered XV-12, XV-20I, and XV-10/17th, 18th, and 19th legions, but not much additional backup nearby. And since the region had been quiet for a while, Varus's guard was down. Arminius and his co-conspirators decided that if they were ever going to reclaim their land, they should strike now, before Roman rule was fully cemented. Yet they also knew they could not take those legions in a head-on clash on open ground. That would be doomed. The Germans had numbers, but were mostly lightly armed farmers and hunters turned fighters. They lacked the siege weapons, the discipline, and the heavy armor of the Romans. They would have to use cunning, surprise, and the terrain itself as their allies. And here, the terrain of Germania was indeed on their side. Endless forests, boggy swamps, and hilly ground that could nullify the Roman advantages. So Arminius devised a plan of deception. He continued to play the part of the loyal friend to Varus. Picture him riding alongside Varus in the column on sunny days earlier that summer, laughing, sharing meals in the Roman camp, perhaps giving advice on local affairs. Many evenings he likely sat at Varus's table, speaking Latin politely, telling the governor which tribes were peaceful, maybe which minor troubles he could help smooth out. Varus believed he had a valuable ally, even a friend, in this charismatic young Germanic noble, and Arminius carefully reinforced that belief. All the while, messages were traveling in secret between the tribes. Quiet agreements were being made, when to rise, where to gather warriors, how to coordinate multiple tribes that normally had no single leader. It was an unprecedented alliance the Germans were forming, thanks largely to Arminius's diplomacy and the shared urgency to expel the invader. One figure, however, did smell something amiss. Segestes, who happened to be a prominent Cherusci chief, and ironically, the father-in-law of Arminius. Segestes never trusted Arminius's intentions toward Rome. He warned Varus that Arminius might be plotting something, and one imagines Segestes perhaps quietly approaching Varus or a Roman officer and cautioning, "Do not trust that one." But Varus dismissed such warnings. How could he believe that Arminius, who had served Rome so faithfully, who spoke perfect Latin and wore a Roman sword, would betray them? Varus thought these rumors were just intertribal jealousy or false alarms. He even scolded those who doubted Arminius, calling them overly suspicious or fearful. This complacency would cost him dearly. Now, in late summer of the year 9, as Varus prepares to move his forces back toward their winter quarters on the Rhine, or perhaps to deal with routine administration, the trap is ready to be sprung. Arminius and the allied chiefs arrange for a staged provocation. News comes to Varus of a rebellion or uprising among a tribe somewhere to the northwest of his current position. This is part of the ruse. Think of Varus in his headquarters tent, a messenger arriving breathlessly with reports that a distant village or a regional clan has revolted, perhaps attacking a Roman tax gatherer or a small Roman outpost. The reports are likely exaggerated or fabricated entirely by the conspirators. Arminius, standing by Varus's side, earnestly confirms that yes, there is trouble, and advises Varus that a show of force is needed to quell it. Varus takes the bait. To him, this seems like a chance to demonstrate Rome's authority swiftly. Likely he imagines marching there, frightening the disobedient tribe into submission, and then returning to base. However, this means Varus will have to lead his army off the usual safe routes. The Roman forces were at that time somewhere near the Weser River in Cheruscan territory, which is in the region of modern northern Germany. To reach the reported trouble spot, Varus decides to take a detour from the easy route back west. Arminius, no doubt, offers to guide him through the unfamiliar territory. After all, Arminius knows the land well, and Varus trusts his guidance. The Roman army, under Varus, begins to march westward towards the Rhine, but instead of following a well-scouted path, they turn into a narrowing track that leads through the heavily forested Teutoburg Forest region, though the Romans might not have had a specific name for it, they just knew it as trackless woods of the Cherusci. It is worth understanding the geography here. In this part of Germania, dense forested hills rise in the south, while to the north lie low-lying wetlands and bogs. Between these two obstacles, the hills and the marshes, is a relatively narrow strip of passable terrain, essentially a corridor that winds through woods and slopes. A Roman road, in the normal sense, barely exists here. At best, there are some paths that have been widened by previous troop movements or local travel. Much of the area is primeval forest, where ancient oak and beech trees loom high and intertwine their branches, making it dim even at midday. Imagine looking ahead down that path. On the day the march begins, you see an endless line of Roman soldiers and wagons snaking into the green gloom of the forest. The column is very long. Perhaps 15,000 to 20,000 people are moving with Varus. There are the 3 legions of heavy infantry, each legion alone having nearly 5,000 men when at full strength. In addition, there are auxiliary troops, cavalry squadrons, light infantry from allied peoples, scouts and archers. And then there are all the camp followers and support people. A train of wagons carry supplies, siege equipment, tents, the officers' baggage and perhaps luxury items. Pack mules and horses are laden with sacks of grain, barrels of water or wine, and bundles of fodder. With the army move families and servants. Though Roman regulations discourage legionaries from bringing families on campaigns, in relatively peaceful occupation duties like this, it wasn't uncommon for soldiers' unofficial wives or children to travel behind the lines, or for merchants and sutlers to accompany the legions to sell goods. There might even be a few local guides or hostages present, and enslaved people serving the officers. We know from accounts that indeed women, children and servants were part of Varus's caravan. Try to picture all of this winding through the woods. It's not just a fighting force, it's almost a migrating community on the move. The column likely stretches miles from front to rear. And crucially, Varus has not ordered a tight marching formation or heavy scouting precautions because he does not expect an attack. He believes he's in friendly territory among people he has subjugated and who appear loyal. Some detachments of Roman troops have even been sent out to distant villages at local request, leaving the main body a bit under strength. A calculated, but as it turns out, fatal mistake. Those small groups sent to keep the peace in various settlements are at this very moment being ambushed and overrun by the tribes as part of the synchronized revolt. Varus doesn't know that yet. In fact, as the central column moves, Arminius and a few other Germanic riders are still with Varus, pointing the way, riding up and down, ostensibly to coordinate allied reinforcements. The weather has been worsening. Skies that were cloudy in the morning have darkened to a leaden grey by noon. A light drizzle turns into steadier rain. Soon, a gusty wind picks up, making the treetops sway and creak. You hear the sound of the wind moaning through the branches and feel the temperature drop a little as dampness penetrates everything. The Romans, who are used to Mediterranean climates, or at least dry conditions, find this weather miserable. Cloaks are pulled tighter, and some soldiers probably curse under their breath as their sandals slide in the mud. As the wind grows, occasionally a stronger gust snaps a dead branch high above. Imagine marching and suddenly hearing a loud crack. A heavy bough tumbles down from the canopy, crashing onto the path behind you. Perhaps it smashes the corner of a wagon or startles a mule into bucking. Incidents like these cause starts and shouts in the line. Each time, hearts jump, nerves fray just a little more. Rainwater is making the ground slick and treacherous. The path weaves around trees and fallen logs, sometimes skirting marshy patches where the recent rains have flooded the ground. In places where a stream or boggy area intersects the trail, Roman engineers have to lay down planks or quickly throw together a small bridge to get the wagons across. An arduous task while the wind lashes and rain falls. They are essentially building the road as they go, cutting away dense underbrush, felling some trees that block passage, and laying improvised causeways over puddles and creeks. This slows the march terribly. Gaps open up between units. The legionaries, burdened by their armor and packs, struggle to maintain a steady pace on the muddy ground, while the baggage carts in the rear might get stuck or stall, causing the whole line behind to halt intermittently. There might be times when the line stops moving altogether for minutes as soldiers ahead try to clear an obstacle. During these pauses, men stand in the rain, shifting from foot to foot, stamping to keep warm, rubbing their aching shoulders. The forest around them is eerily quiet aside from the rain's patter and wind. Some soldiers glance warily at the tree line. All they see are endless trunks disappearing into dimness. To many of them, these German woods always have an intimidating aura. Unlike the open plains of home or the tidy farms of Italy, this land feels untamed and full of unseen eyes. Some may recall scary campfire tales of wild Germanic warriors or forest spirits. But then they remind themselves that Arminius and the other allied chiefs have scouted ahead, and no alarm has been raised. Surely if there were any enemies about, the Roman scouts or the loyal Germanic cavalry would have alerted them by now. At some point along this tense march, Arminius makes his move. He has been riding at the head of a column of Germanic auxiliary cavalry, men of his tribe, ostensibly serving Rome. These men are part of the conspiracy too, of course. Possibly, as the weather worsened, Arminius turned to Varus and volunteered to ride ahead to rally some friendly tribesmen or to scout the reported uprising further on. Varus allowed it, so Arminius and the other Germanic riders peel away from the Roman column, trotting off down a side path and quickly vanishing behind a screen of trees and rain. Varus would have assumed they were going to gather help and return. He still has no idea that his trusted friend is about to become his worst enemy. Now the stage is set, the Roman column labours onward, maybe unaware that they've been effectively abandoned by their guides and that they are now on their own in the forest. Overhead, the afternoon is growing dark as storm clouds thicken. The wind howls and perhaps distant thunder grumbles. You can imagine the legionaries tightening the straps on their helmets and keeping heads down against stinging cold rain. They are probably spread out in a rather disorderly fashion. Later accounts note that they were marching not in any regular order but mixed in with the wagons and non-combatants. This is a crucial detail. Normally, a Roman commander in enemy territory would keep his legionaries in a compact formation, with scouts out front, flanks guarded by cavalry, and baggage in the center or rear protected. But Varus thought this was essentially a routine march through pacified lands. So caution was laxed. The Romans walking beside ox-drawn carts, or women with children on ponies, were taken by surprise when the ambush was finally sprung. It begins subtly, perhaps. You're walking, hearing only the rain and your comrades' footfalls, when suddenly a faint swish comes from the underbrush, then a wet thunk as something hits the ground by your feet. Before you realize what it is, more objects whistle out of the trees. Javelins and darts begin to arc in from both sides of the path. In an instant, confused cries erupt along the line. A soldier a few yards ahead of you pitches forward with a short spear protruding from his neck. Another behind you doubles over, hit in the side through a gap in his armor. Panic flares as men fumble for their shields and swords, but many have their shields strapped to their backs or piled in wagons due to the march. The enemy remains largely unseen, just shadows behind trunks, launching projectiles and then ducking away. The Germanic warriors have chosen the perfect moment to strike. The Romans are strung out and unprepared, and a storm is raging which muffles sound and vision. The forest suddenly comes alive with the whoops and cries of the attackers. From densely forested slope to the south, and perhaps from the marshy north side too, bands of Germanic fighters charge forward. They know the terrain intimately. Little footpaths invisible to the Romans allow them to maneuver around and hit multiple spots at once. Imagine being one of the Roman legionaries in that moment. One heartbeat you were marching quietly. The next, all around is chaos and noise. You can barely see the attackers. They are fleeting figures among the trees, hurling spears, then rushing in with crude pikes, clubs, or long knives. Many of these tribesmen wear no armor, just a cloak or bare chest, which makes them swift. Their hair might be long and matted, some possibly lime-washed into wild styles to intimidate. They likely scream war cries invoking their gods, or frightening the Romans with howls. The Roman officers shout desperately for order. Form ranks, stand together, but on this narrow, muddy trail, order is hard to come by. Small knots of legionaries manage to cluster and raise their shields. Others are caught off guard among the wagons and civilians. A team of mules at the front of a wagon panics as spears hit them. They rear and bolt, causing the wagon to lurch and tip, spilling its contents and blocking the path. Scenes like this multiply all up and down the column. One wagon overturns, then another. A blockage forms on the road, penning the Romans in as more missiles rain down. We should remember, the Roman soldier is well trained for battle, but this is unlike any battle formation they know. There is no clear enemy line to charge, no field to deploy their usual tactics. It's an ambush, sudden, confusing, coming from all directions. Think of the noise, the thud of arrows striking shields or tree trunks, the screams of wounded men and animals, the blare of a Roman horn somewhere as a signaller tries vainly to sound an alarm or assembly call. Thunder booms overhead and a cold downpour intensifies, as if nature itself is conspiring with the attackers. In the melee, some Roman legionaries try to fight back. They use their short swords, the gladius, designed for stabbing in close quarters, to engage any foe who gets near. A few Germans who rush too far in are skewered by disciplined thrusts or cut down by a Roman officer's sword, but these are isolated encounters. The Germanic warriors are mostly keeping a short distance at first, leveraging their throwing weapons. They duck behind trees, then pop out to slash at a straggler on the edges. The legionaries attempt to form a shield wall where they can, but many didn't have shields ready in time. Those who do raise their large rectangular scimitar overhead and to the flanks, trying to ward off the projectiles. It provides some protection, but not enough. With no clear line or unit cohesion, the Romans are essentially fighting in small groups or alone. A legionary might find himself back to back with a comrade, fending off a couple of axe-wielding tribesmen, while another cluster of Romans is 30 paces away doing the same, with confusion and fleeing non-combatants in between. Yes, the camp followers are caught in this too. One can imagine a Roman woman, perhaps the wife of a centurion, cowering under a wagon, clutching her child, as shrieking warriors dash past, chasing a fleeing cook or servant. Some non-combatants try to run, only to be cut down or dragged by the swift-footed assailants. It's a slaughter for those unarmed portions of the column. Many are killed in the first onrush, which only adds to the panic of the soldiers who see their loved ones or attendants slaughtered. Discipline, the hallmark of Roman might, starts to erode in this chaos. Varus himself, somewhere near the middle or front of the column, is likely stunned by the suddenness of the attack. We don't know specifics of his actions, but we can imagine him trying to coordinate a response. Perhaps he shouts for his officers to rally the men, trumpeters attempt to blow signals, maybe the call to regroup or to indicate a direction to face, but the dense foliage and cacophony make communications nearly impossible. In a normal battle, legions could see their standards, the silver eagle on a pole each legion carried, and form around them. Here, glimpsing an eagle's standard through the trees and rain might be hard. Still, some centurions, the veteran sergeants of the Roman army, bellow at their men to hold the line. These centurions are tough and brave. They won't go down without fighting hard. Some surely plant their feet and encourage their soldiers to make a stand, perhaps forming a defensive circle with shields overlapping. In spots where this happens, the Germans at first may fall back slightly, wary of the disciplined push, but such pockets of order are few. Consider also the Roman cavalry in this scenario. Varus had a contingent of horsemen, both Roman and allied. On a clear plain, these cavalry could have scouted or counterattacked swiftly. In the forest, though, the cavalry find it nearly impossible to operate. There's no room to gallop, horses slip on muddy ground, or shy at the chaotic press of wagons and fighting men. Some cavalrymen likely dismount to fight on foot when their horses become more a liability than an asset. Others attempt to find a way out of the melee, perhaps to circle around and hit the attackers from the rear. But the Germans know the forest paths intimately. Any cavalry unit that tries to break out might be lured deeper and then surrounded and wiped out piecemeal. The first phase of the ambush lasts for hours, perhaps until approaching nightfall. The Romans suffer heavy casualties. Many lie dead or wounded along that churned-up trail. It's said that as the rain continued and daylight faded, Varus managed to pull together the survivors to avoid total annihilation on the first day. The Romans fought desperately to carve out an encampment before dark. They looked for any small hill or defensible spot. At last, they found a somewhat higher piece of ground, maybe an area where the forest thinned on a slope, and they rallied there. Think of the exhaustion and shock on the soldiers' faces as they stumble into a perimeter to fortify for the night. They immediately begin trying to erect a camp rampart, using their trenching tools to dig a shallow ditch and piling earth and logs as a makeshift wall. The Roman military practice was always to build a fortified camp each evening, especially in enemy territory, but this time it's done in dire circumstances and under pressure. All around, in the gloom beneath the trees, the Germanic warriors lurk and watch. They've blooded the Romans, but as night falls, they withdraw, just out of range, surrounding the encampment at a distance. They know the Romans are like a wounded animal now, and they can afford to wait for an easier chance to finish them off. From the Roman side, as darkness fully envelops the forest, one can imagine the scene inside their camp. It's raining steadily, a cold, relentless downpour. The ground inside the camp is trampled mud. Many wounded are moaning or crying for help. With limited medical supplies and chaos, there is only so much the medics and fellow soldiers can do. Some injured men have to be left outside the rampart when the perimeter is closed. Perhaps they couldn't drag them all in time. Those unfortunate souls likely fall prey to the Germans right after. Muffled cries in the darkness might be heard as warriors finish off stragglers. It's a night of dread for the Romans. They light only minimal fires, if any, because firelight could draw enemy missiles or mark targets for night attacks. Most men huddle in the dark, soaked and shivering, every rustle in the woods making them flinch. The usual comfort of a Roman camp, tents, warm food and camaraderie, is absent. They had to abandon or burn much of their baggage and wagons just to be able to move faster. So their tents and cooking pots, even much of their food, is gone. Before night fell, Varus gave orders to destroy anything that wasn't absolutely needed. That included wagons stuck in mud and heavy equipment. Fires were set to those wagons to prevent them from falling into enemy hands or simply left behind. Now, likely a few pyres of smouldering wagons light the forest gloom here and there, casting flickering shadows. Imagine being a Roman legionary that night, sitting on your pack or a stump, not daring to lie down in the cold mud. You clutch your sword or spear tight. You peer into the darkness until your eyes ache, thinking every silhouette of a tree could be an approaching attacker. The usual sounds of nature continue, pattering rain, the sigh of wind, perhaps distant thunder rumbling now and then. But layered atop that, you might catch snippets of an eerie sound, the chanting or taunting of Germanic warriors out in the dark. Maybe they call out in their tongue, mocking the Romans or making terrifying whoops to keep the invaders on edge. The Roman officers quietly move around, trying to check on the men's positions, making sure the improvised palisade is manned. There will be no restful sleep this night, only fatigue and anxiety. In the governor's circle, Varus and his senior staff convene to decide their next move. They likely bring a small lantern under a leather cloak to look at a soaked map or discuss options in hushed tones. Varus now knows this is a full-scale uprising and that Arminius has betrayed him. Perhaps anger mixes with fear in him. He might curse Arminius' name under his breath, shocked that he was duped so thoroughly. But there is no time for brooding. They must find a way out. Likely they conclude that staying put would mean eventual starvation, or being surrounded by ever-growing enemy forces. The best hope is to break out of the woods, reach open ground where the legions could fight properly, or at least move faster, and head for the safety of a Roman fort or garrison on the Rhine or elsewhere. There might have been a debate. Some officers might suggest fortifying and waiting for rescue, but rescue is unlikely. None of them could know if reinforcements even know about their plight. Communication is cut. Any messengers sent would have to slip through miles of enemy-filled forest. On the other hand, if they can get closer to Roman bases, perhaps they can send word or even encounter relief forces. Thus, the decision is made as soon as dawn breaks, they will try to march again, in tighter order this time, toward the west, towards somewhere safe like the fortified town of Haltern or another known Roman position along the Lippe or Rhine. And so the men spend that miserable night in the rain, hungry, hearts pounding whenever a twig snaps in the darkness. A few may drift into an uneasy doze from sheer exhaustion, only to jolt awake if a comrade stirs or cries out from a nightmare. Then, if he wakes up, there's no telling what they will do. Unfortunately, others cannot sleep at all. They stare into nothingness, maybe silently praying to whatever gods they worship, Jupiter or Mars for the Roman perhaps, or a quick thought to their household spirits back home to see the dawn. At last dawn comes, pale and grey through the dripping branches. The rain has slackened a bit to a fine mist, clinging to every surface. The Romans prepare to move out, abandoning the makeshift camp. They likely leave behind those too wounded to walk, with heavy hearts, and perhaps a word of comfort or a silent apology. It was a brutal calculus of ancient warfare. Those who couldn't keep up had to be left, as carrying them could doom everyone. The wounded left behind knew their fate, and we can imagine the despair as they watched their comrades depart, hearing the approach of enemy warriors soon after. Varus's remaining force reorganizes as best as it can. They probably destroyed a number of their wagons already, but any survivors still have some. Varus might order further reduction of baggage. Only essential weapons and maybe minimal food are kept. All heavy or bulky items are discarded. The legionaries could carry some on their backs, but they're already laden with armor and weapons. Every man shoulders whatever he can. In this way, the army sets off again. They try to march in a more compact formation now, perhaps with legionaries surrounding any remaining baggage and non-combatants in the center, and flanks guarded by what's left of the cavalry. They are on high alert, scanning the tree line for any movement. For a time, as the early morning progresses, the Romans make some headway. The Germanic ambushers are still around, shadowing them, but now the Romans are expecting trouble, and their formation is a bit more defensible. When the Germans dart out to launch an attack, the Romans fight them off more effectively in these morning hours. It is said the Romans even reached a stretch of open ground by late morning or midday. Perhaps the forest thinned or gave way to a clearing, or some farmers' fields, maybe near the edge of the hilly region by the forest. Reaching this open country is a small relief for Varus's men. Under the broad daylight, even if cloudy, and away from the tight choke of trees, they can see the enemy coming and organize lines. There may even have been a pitched skirmish in this clearing where the Romans temporarily held their own. We can imagine legionaries forming a rough line, shield to shield, and repelling German charges. A lot of the attackers might have hung back at this show of renewed resistance, perhaps deciding to wait until conditions favored them again. The Romans might have tried to send a messenger or scout from this open area to go find help. We don't know if any made it, but it's possible a few riders were dispatched toward the Rhine with pleas for relief. If they did, it would still be days before any help could reach them. Far too late for Varus. After crossing this patch of open terrain, perhaps a grassy valley or fields, the Roman survivors unfortunately had to plunge back into the woods to continue their westward escape. By now, they had already taken significant losses, likely thousands were dead or incapacitated from the first ambush, but many still marched, grimly determined to survive. Some might have felt a spark of hope when they were in the open, only to have that hope dim as they looked ahead at yet another expanse of dark forest they needed to traverse. The afternoon of this second day, or it could be considered the third day, counting from the first surprise midday attack, brought new torments. The Germans, encouraged that the Romans were still within reach, renewed their assault as the legions entered the wooded area again. This part of the forest might have been the actual Teutoburg Forest ridge or its vicinity. The land could be uneven, with ridges and ravines. The Romans advanced in a tighter column, but the path forced them into a narrow front once more. Here, Arminius had anticipated their route. There is archaeological evidence that the Germanic warriors prepared a kind of earthen rampart or wall along part of the forest edge, possibly at a choke point near modern Calcresi. They likely took advantage of terrain, a hill on one side, a swamp on the other, and built a long camouflaged wall of sod and timber as cover. Behind this wall, hundreds of warriors could hide and then rise up to attack the passing column virtually at arm's length. It's possible that the worst carnage occurred here in this phase. As the Romans moved between the hill and marsh, the Germans launched another ambush from behind their wall and from the woods all around. The column, compressed by the narrow path, became a killing zone. A rain of javelins and sling stones fell upon the tightly packed legionaries. This time, the Romans attempted a counter-tactic. Some cavalry and infantry tried a coordinated charge into the woods to scatter the attackers. We can almost see a brave Roman officer shouting, "Follow me!" and a group of legionaries and horsemen rushing into the trees in pursuit of the elusive enemy. But in this confined space, discipline again breaks down. Horsemen collide with foot soldiers as they all try to maneuver in the brush. Men trip over gnarled roots or slip on wet leaves. Their tight battle formations are useless when trees stand in the way, breaking units into fragments. In these conditions, Romans even accidentally bump and jostle into one another. There are accounts of friendly units colliding in the chaos, adding to confusion. Now, the Germanic fighters counterattack any such sally fiercely. They isolate those Romans who charge down, surrounding them in terrain they know intimately. Many Romans fall separated from their fellows. Centurions fighting bravely might suddenly find themselves encircled by jeering warriors, speared from multiple sides. Despite fending off one or two, the cavalry that plunged into the woods find themselves hemmed in by dense growth. Horses are brought down by spears to their flanks, throwing their riders, who are then overrun. Piece by piece, the Roman force is whittled down further. During this frenzied fighting, a critical moment occurs. One of the legion's eagle standards is lost. The eagle was more than just a banner. It was the soul of the legion, a silver or gold emblem that soldiers swore to protect with their lives. Losing it was a source of immense shame. Perhaps in the swirl of battle, a German warrior managed to kill the aquilifer, the standard bearer of one legion, and snatch the eagle from his grasp. A shout of triumph would ring out from the Germanic side at that moment, and a groan of despair from nearby Romans. Seeing an eagle taken would have been a psychological blow. It signaled that a legion, essentially, was considered destroyed when its eagle was captured. Some soldiers, witnessing the eagle captured, might have flown into a desperate rage, attempting to recover it, only to be cut down. Others lost heart even more. Slowly but surely, the Roman line of march disintegrated into segments. Some groups still resisted stubbornly, clumped around the remaining standards perhaps, but others started to break away, running or crawling into the woods, trying to save themselves individually. Yet despite these terrible losses, not all the Romans perished on this second day. A portion of them, led by Varus or other officers, fought their way through the worst stretch of forest by evening. They may have inflicted some casualties on the Germans too. After all, a cornered Roman legionary could be a deadly fighter, and not every swing of a sword missed its mark. The Germans did suffer dead and wounded as well, although they could afford more due to their numbers and reinforcements joining. As night fell again, the shattered Roman army attempted another camp or resting place. This time, perhaps they had not the strength or time to build anything elaborate. They may have just halted wherever they could assemble a defensive stance, maybe a low hill or some area slightly easier to watch, and collapse there for the night. This second night, or third, depending on how one counts, from the initial ambush onset, might have been even more horrific for Roman morale. Their numbers were much reduced, many officers were dead, and supplies nearly gone. They were deep in the wilderness, unsure exactly which way safety lay, as the normal sense of direction can get muddled when forced off roads. Perhaps some still clung to hope that if they could march one more day, they might break out toward the Rhine or find a friendly outpost, but others surely sensed doom. They had seen the enemy only grow in number. More and more tribal warriors had flocked to join Arminius when word of the Roman rout spread. Earlier on, some tribes were hesitant, but seeing Varus's columns falter, many opportunists joined the attack, hoping for plunder and glory. By now, nearly every local warrior in the region must have been involved in hunting down the Romans. Among the Romans that night was a high-ranking cavalry commander named Arminius and Varus. His actions have been recorded as an example of faltering resolve. At some point, possibly during that evening or early the next morning, Varus decided to take the remaining Roman cavalry and attempt to flee for the Rhine, abandoning the infantry to their fate. It's easy to judge his cowardice from a safe perspective, but imagine his mindset. He saw no way all the legions would survive. Perhaps he thought if he could ride ahead, he could bring help, or at least save himself and his riders. So under cover of darkness or the early gloom, he and those mounted troops who agreed bolted away from the main body, trying to gallop westward through any path or open terrain they could find. However, splitting off and running only made them an easier target. Arminius likely anticipated such a move. Germanic horsemen, yes, some tribes had cavalry of their own or could chase on swift ponies, pursued Arminius and Varus' fleeing contingent. In the tangle of forests and marshes, one by one the Roman riders were caught, pulled off their horses or speared as they ran. Varus himself was overtaken and killed. His bold but selfish attempt did not succeed, and it left the remaining legionaries even more alone. One can imagine the despair of the foot soldiers, seeing the dust or hearing the distant hoofbeats of their own cavalry deserting them, only later perhaps to hear those hoofbeats abruptly stop with faint screams carrying over the wind, indicating that those comrades too had been slaughtered. So here we are, likely on what would be the third morning since the ambush started, by Roman counting of days. By now, Varus's once proud force is reduced to a terrified, ragged band. 3 eagles they carried, possibly 1 or 2 are already lost. The last is in jeopardy. They know their general Varus is still alive, but he must have been wounded at some point, as accounts mention he had injuries, perhaps from an arrow or a spear graze. Many senior officers are dead. The men are exhausted beyond measure. They have barely slept, marched and fought continuously in awful weather, and haven't had a proper meal. Hunger gnaws at their bellies. Perhaps they chewed some strips of dried meat or stale bread, if any was in their pouches, but most of the food was lost with the baggage. Thirst might be less an issue due to rain, but that same rain has sapped their body heat and comfort. Dawn the next day brings, unfortunately, another turn of the weather. As if guided by a cruel fate, a new storm breaks out. The wind picks up again, howling through the treetops that remain ahead on their route, and drenching rain begins falling in sheets. The ground, already saturated, becomes a quagmire. Roman shields, made of wood and leather, are now thoroughly soaked. Water dripping from the edges as men heft them. The weight of wet equipment drags on every muscle. Cloaks and tunics cling heavily to bodies. Water sloshes in their boots. They push on regardless, because to stop is to die. But the rain and wind soon reach almost tempest levels, making it hard even to keep one's footing. Imagine walking on slippery ground. as gusts try to shove you sideways while carrying a heavy shield that now catches the wind like a sail. Some men perhaps simply cannot go on and drop out, collapsing under a tree, maybe to be later found by pursuers and killed, or to die of exposure. The Germans, meanwhile, take advantage of these conditions. Unlike the Romans, the Germanic warriors carry much lighter gear. Many have no armor at all, and they're used to the terrain. They move in small groups through the forest parallel to the Romans, keeping just out of reach until the moment to strike. The wind and rain bother them too, surely, but not as severely. If anything, it spurs them on, believing their storm god or forest spirits are on their side, weakening the foreigners. Arminius himself is likely among them somewhere, directing the final act of the ambush. We can imagine him moving with agility through the woods, exhorting his fighters, keep up the pressure, they are almost done. Perhaps he reminds them of past wrongs suffered under Rome, fueling their anger to ensure none lose momentum. They might also be motivated by tangible reward. The Roman baggage held treasure and valuable weapons, the legionaries carry arms and armor worth looting, and even the very pride of annihilating a Roman army is a prize. More and more tribesmen have joined, including those who initially hesitated. By now the numbers surrounding the Romans have swollen. Some estimates say that several thousand Germanic warriors were part of the battle by the end, greatly outnumbering the remaining Romans. In this final stage, the Romans can barely defend themselves. Every time a man tries to throw a javelin or shoot an arrow, the wind knocks it off course. Bowstrings are slack when wet, and few arrows fly true. The throwing spears, pilum, that legionaries normally hurl at the enemy before closing in, are also less effective after being soaked. Maybe they can still be used in close quarters to stab, but casting them in the wind yields poor range. Swords, being short, require the enemy to be at arm's length, but the enemy often stays a bit beyond that, launching darts or lunging with longer spears, then backing off. Shields, being waterlogged, might not actually be immensely heavier. Modern tests suggest not too much weight is added, but the psychological effect and the slippery grips might hinder their use. Hands are numb and wrinkled from constant wet cold, making it harder to grip a sword hilt firmly. Then there is the mud. The road, such as it was, might now be a channel of sticky mud. Each step for a legionary in his hobnailed sandals might sink him ankle deep. Pulling one foot out to take the next step becomes a tiring chore. If he tries to step off the track to firmer ground, ease into the thick undergrowth or maybe into swampy puddles that could be even worse. Horses that remain get mired to their hocks, unable to effectively charge. All around, Germanic warriors press closer. The confidence of the barbarians is at its peak. They know the Romans are nearly broken. They adopt more aggressive tactics now, not just hit and run. Groups of warriors wielding heavy clubs or axes rush the stragglers and isolated squads, engaging in brutal hand-to-hand fights. We can envision a final collapse of Roman discipline. Perhaps one legion's remnants become separated from another's, leaving gaps that enemies exploit to break them apart further. Some Roman soldiers might throw down their weapons in surrender or despair, only to be cut down mercilessly. The Germans are in no mood to take many prisoners, except maybe for a few high-ranking ones to sacrifice later, or ransom, and most accounts say they slaughtered without mercy at this point. At the heart of what's left of the Roman column, Governor Varus realizes the battle is truly lost. It's said that Varus, not wishing to be captured alive, knowing the fate that would await him, likely torture and humiliation before death, chooses to take his own life. Picture Varus, wounded, exhausted, his grand cloak torn and muddied, standing or perhaps mounted on a weary horse, as the encirclement tightens. The shouts of the enemy are growing louder all around, the ring of steel closer. Maybe one of his close officers, like Lucius Aegius or Seonus, some of his lieutenants named in history, is at his side, similarly grim-faced. They exchange a final resigned look. Varus then draws his sword, same gladius he used for ceremonial duties, and in a somber, resolute motion, he falls upon it. This means he likely stabbed the blade into his own chest or belly, using his weight to make it quick. Painful choice, but for a Roman of his standing, it was considered more honorable than falling into enemy hands. His officers, seeing Varus do this, follow suit. The highest ranking Romans commit suicide together at that moment. Perhaps they have a brief moment to bid farewell or utter a dedication to their families back home or to Rome. Each then plunges their sword into themselves, collapsing one by one in the mud. It's a tragic end, these men who commanded legions now lying lifeless in a forest far from home, but in their minds likely preferable to the alternative. When the remaining troops realize that their leadership is gone, possibly someone sees Varus fall on his sword or word spreads quickly, whatever thin thread of order was left snaps completely. Those still fighting now either choose to likewise end it or simply lose the will to resist and are cut down. Some Romans emulate their commanders and take their own lives with their daggers or by thrusting themselves onto an enemy spear even. Others just drop their shields and collapse in surrender or exhaustion, only to be slaughtered on the spot by the vengeful tribesmen. A few Romans, at the very last, attempt to flee blindly. Small handfuls break into the woods, trying to get away individually or in pairs. The forest, however, is crawling with Germans now, and such fugitives rarely get far. One by one, they are run down. Perhaps a couple of very lucky ones manage to hide, maybe submerging themselves in a muddy pool, breathing through reeds, or crawling into a hollow log until the danger passes. If any did, they would be among the extremely few survivors who later could tell the tale. It's likely, though, that almost everyone still within the ambush zone by this third day's end was killed or captured. Thus, after 3 days of running battle, the Roman army is annihilated. The rain finally begins to ease, as the last screams fade and are replaced by the victorious shouts of the Germanic warriors. It might be afternoon or evening by the time the fighting fully subsides. The forest is littered with Roman bodies, legionaries, auxiliaries, officers, horses, and the wreckage of wagons, broken shields, spears sticking out of mud, standards thrown to the ground. Here and there, small fires flicker where some debris burns, casting a hazy smoke that mingles with the mist. The chaos of war slowly gives way to an eerie silence, broken only by the cawing of crows already descending on the scene, and the groans of any dying who still cling to life. The Germanic victims now roam the battlefield, looting freely. They strip armor and weapons from the Roman dead, a fine haul, as Roman swords and helmets are valuable and far superior to much of their own equipment. Many a warrior who had fought half naked picks up a Roman helmet and places it on his head with grim pride. All slings a captured shield on his arm. They gather up coins from the pay chests. Varus's army would have carried money to pay the troops, likely now scattered from broken chests. The tribes had no use for Roman discipline, but Roman gold and silver? Certainly. They also gather trophies. In the custom of many ancient warriors, taking body parts of enemies was a way to boast of one's kills or to offer to their gods. Some cut off heads of particularly brave Roman officers they slew, to later mount them or present to their chieftains. There is an account that the Germanic fighters found Varus's lifeless body. Somehow they recognized him, perhaps by his attire, or because someone who saw him die pointed it out. In any case, upon identifying Varus, they took his head. Arminius had a plan for that head, but more on that in a moment. As twilight falls on the Teutoburg Forest, the Germanic warriors hold what essentially becomes a celebration on the battlefield. To them, this is an almost unimaginable victory. They have destroyed not one, but 3 Roman legions, something unheard of. Remember, Rome was the superpower of the time, thought to be nearly invincible in pitched combat, and yet these tribal fighters, considered barbarians by Rome, outsmarted and outfought a much better equipped force by using their land and trickery. There must have been jubilation, war songs shouted into the night sky, perhaps dances among the fires. They likely gave thanks to their gods, such as Donar, Thor, or Wodan, or the various local deities of war and forest. In their belief, the gods had clearly favored them, sending storms to aid and giving them the Romans into their hands. They also carry out rituals. Captured Roman officers, especially high-ranking ones who survived, meet gruesome ends as offerings. Tacitus later wrote that altars were found in the nearby groves, on which these Roman tribunes and centurions were sacrificed to the Germanic gods. Try to imagine a solemn, frightening scene in a clearing among ancient oaks, as torches flicker, a captured Roman officer, perhaps bound or wounded, is brought before a rough-hewn wooden altar. Germanic priests or chieftains, possibly including Arminius himself, offer prayers or chants to their deities. The prisoners may have known what was coming, but they are helpless. One by one, they are slain ceremonially, their throats cut or hearts pierced, their blood given in tribute to the spirits of the forest and war, thanking them for the victory. It's gruesome, yes, but remember, this is being recounted quietly and matter-of-factly as a part of the historical reality. The forest knight would have seen these sacrificial fires and heard the final cries of those officers who had survived the battle, only to die as offerings. Not just officers either. Some accounts mention gibbets, which are like gallows or wooden crosses on which captives were hanged or otherwise executed slowly, and pits in the ground where living captives might have been thrown, perhaps to suffer. Such was the rage and fervor of the victors that mercy was in short supply. These acts also served as a terrifying message, a demonstration that the Romans were utterly defeated, body and soul. Amidst all of this, Arminius stands as the unifier and leader. Perhaps on a vantage point or the very earthen wall used in ambush, he harangues his warriors, praising their bravery and proclaiming that Germaniae, the German lands, are free of Roman chains. In later years, some said he boasted by mocking the Roman eagles and standards they captured, raising them up as if to taunt the spirits of the fallen legions. For Arminius personally, this is a moment of triumph and vindication. He has repaid Rome for whatever slights, and used his intimate knowledge of Roman ways to bring about one of Rome's worst disasters. Now, think of the aftermath in immediate terms. Out of those tens of thousands of Romans and camp followers, almost none remain alive in that forest. The few that might have been spared were probably enslaved. Some common soldiers, especially auxiliaries who maybe surrendered early, could be kept alive to be slaves to the tribes. A far cry from their previous life, but a life nonetheless. A handful of higher status survivors might be kept for ransom or as hostages, but since Varus's force had been seen as oppressors, it's likely most were killed. Historical sources indicate a few survivors from the battle were indeed taken as slaves by Varus' Germanic families, and interestingly, years or decades later, a few were ransomed or retrieved by the Romans, scarred and older, having spent a long time in captivity. You can imagine one such survivor, maybe a legionary, who managed to hide during the bloodiest part, then was found and taken as a slave on a farm deep in the woods. He might survive years tending cattle for a Germanic master, always haunted by the memory of those days of slaughter, until one day he's traded back to the Romans at a border exchange. But for the most part, the Roman army in Germania, east of the Rhine, has ceased to exist. It's a quiet night after the revelry dies down. The forest that witnessed so much human agony returns to a deceptive calm. Mist gathers around tree trunks. Here and there, wolves or wild boars sniff among the corpses. A raven flaps down to perch on a branch, eyeing a still form in iron armor beneath, waiting for safe moments to pick at it. In a glade, the bodies of Varus and his officers lie together where they fell on their own swords, now just inanimate shapes in the dark. One can almost feel the ancient trees standing guard over a graveyard of an army. So ended the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. But our story does not finish here. There is the wider ripple of this event to consider, and the aftermath over subsequent months and years. News of the disaster was not immediate to the Roman world. Remember that in those times, information traveled only as fast as a horse or a boat. The Germanic tribes had no interest in sending word to the Romans. They wanted to exploit the surprise for as long as possible. But inevitably, a few news bearers emerged. One such messenger was perhaps one of those cavalrymen or officers who fled early, or maybe a survivor who managed to slip through the woods unseen for days and reach the Roman bases to the west. Small groups of battered survivors, maybe a handful here, a handful there, did find their way to safety. There was also the fortress of Aliso, which is a Roman stronghold somewhere near the Lippe River, to the west of the battle side. A detachment of Roman troops under a commander named Lucius Cadicius, was stationed there. They realized something was wrong when local tribes around Alasso also rose in rebellion and attempted to besiege the fort. These Roman troops held out behind their walls, fighting off assaults. The Germanic coalition, after annihilating Varus's legions, spread out to secure the region. Many tribes took the opportunity to quickly storm any remaining Roman outposts or small garrisons. Most were overrun, yet Alasso withstood them. The siege dragged on. The Germans, not well versed in siegecraft, tried typical methods like surrounding and starving out the defenders. Inside Alasso, food began to run low. Cadicius held his men together with determined leadership. After some time, maybe weeks, he realized no help might come in time, and staying would mean eventual starvation or surrender. So he planned a daring escape. On a stormy, moonless night, perhaps deliberately choosing weather that mirrored the storm that helped doom Varus, but now to use it to their advantage, the Roman garrison of Alasso silently slipped out. The rain masked their departure, and they sneaked through the enemy lines. Women, children, and any wounded who were in the fort went with them in a silent column. They managed to get by the first and second watch posts of the Germans undetected, but as they reached a third line or more distant encirclement, something heartbreaking occurred. Some of the non-combatants, specifically women and children among the group, in their fear and exhaustion, cried out or made noise. Perhaps a child stumbled and wailed, or a distraught mother could not keep silent. Those sounds alerted the German besiegers. Suddenly, shouts rang out, the escape was discovered, the Germans rushed to attack the fleeing column, all degenerated into confusion. In the dark and mud, a wild scramble ensued. Many of those trying to escape were caught or killed, but Cadicius and a fraction of his men pushed through. According to one account, the Roman trumpeters in the group came up with a clever ruse. They sounded the army trumpet calls, particularly the one for a double-quick march, loudly into the night. The German pursuers, hearing multiple trumpets, thought possibly that it was a Roman relief force arriving, perhaps led by a general named Arminius, who was Varus's relative, commanding legions at the Rhine. This uncertainty caused the Germans to hesitate momentarily, and in that precious window, Cadicius and the survivors got a lead on them. Running for their lives through the dark, a number of them indeed reached the Rhine in safety, where they finally collapsed behind Roman lines. Some others of their party were not so lucky and were run down, but enough made it to tell the tale. At the Rhine, the news was soon relayed up the chain of command. Lucius Nonius Asperinus, Varus's nephew, had been in charge of 2 legions in the province of Germania Inferior, Lower Rhine area, at this time. He swiftly mobilized those legions, I, Germanica, and Via Laude, and took measures to prevent the Germanic tribes from bursting across the Rhine. He secured key bases like Colonia Agrippina, modern Cologne, and Castrovetera, Axanten, on the Rhine frontier. This was critical because had the Germans, flushed with victory, crossed into Gaul, they could have caused widespread panic and damage. But Asperinus's prompt action, bolstering the Rhine defenses, effectively contained the Germanic rebellion to beyond the river. Simultaneously, when the fragmented reports of the catastrophe reached Emperor Augustus in Rome, the effect was devastating. He reportedly went into deep shock and grief. The stories say that for days, even months, Augustus was seen wandering the halls of his palace in a state of despair, striking his head against the walls and moaning, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." Imagine the most powerful man in the world, over 70 years old, who had thought he'd secured peace for his empire, now reduced to tearing his clothes in mourning, his hair grown unkempt because he refused to groom it as a sign of sorrow. That is how deep this wound went in the Roman psyche. Augustus feared that this defeat might inspire not just the Germans, but also the Gauls or other subject peoples to revolt, seeing Rome as weak. There were also rumors he feared that the Germans would not stop at the Rhine, perhaps they'd march through Gaul, even threaten Italy, though in reality the Germanic tribes at that time had no such unified capability to invade that far. The fear and memory of older horrors, like many centuries past when Gauls had sacked Rome, perhaps surfaced in Roman minds. Augustus took swift emergency measures. He ordered new legions to be raised at once to replace the lost ones, but the population was weary of conscription after so many years of war. It said that men eligible for service were reluctant to step forward, so Augustus resorted to a draft by lottery and even punishment. Everyone in a certain number who refused call-up was deprived of property or worse, to compel compliance. Veterans who had already served their time were recalled to duty, as were some freed slaves, an extraordinary measure since normally freedmen wouldn't be legionaries. But the crisis was such that he bent rules. Slowly he scraped together forces to send to the Rhine to reinforce the frontier and prepare for retaliation. On the Germanic side, the alliance celebrated, but it also had decisions to make. Some leaders urged pressing the advantage, possibly even crossing the Rhine to raid Gaul. One big thing held many of them back: a large tribal king to the southeast named Maroboduus of the Marcomanni. He ruled a powerful federation in what is now Bohemia, Central Europe. Arminius had hoped to draw Maroboduus into the anti-Roman war as well. In fact, Arminius sent him a gruesome invitation of sorts. He took the severed head of Varus and sent it to Maroboduus as proof of victory and a token of alliance, implying, "See, we have destroyed Rome's army, join us now, and together we can push Rome back further or take over their territories." Maroboduus, however, was cautious, and perhaps saw Arminius as a rival rather than a partner. He declined to join the uprising. Instead, he treated Varus's head with respect, or at least a form of diplomatic decency, by sending it on to Rome. Eventually, Varus's head reached Augustus, who gave it a proper burial in the family tomb, signifying that Varus, despite his failure, was still acknowledged honorably by his kin. The refusal of Maroboduus to join meant that Arminius's coalition did not expand into a pan-Germanic force to strike the Roman Empire deeper. Moreover, as winter approached at the end of that year 9, the various tribes were content to celebrate their gains and perhaps war among themselves for spoils, rather than marching further the evacuated Roman forts and any nearby friendly villages that were Romanized. Then eventually went home to winter quarters, satisfied that they had cleansed their land of an enemy, at least for now. On the Roman side, General Tiberius, the same who had put down the Balkan revolt and was heir apparent to Augustus, hurried to the Rhine frontier with whatever forces he could gather early the next year, which would be year 10. He conducted security operations, we might call them punitive expeditions, in the border areas, but it appears he didn't immediately try to reconquer all of the territory Varus had held. The new strategy, at least temporarily, was cautious. Secure the Rhine, ensure Gaul's safety, and punish any Germans who dared approach the river. Over the course of the years 10 and 11, Tiberius stabilized the situation. He even managed enough control to declare the area secure and return to Rome in year 12 to celebrate a triumph, a grand parade in Rome for victory. Though Tiberius's triumph claimed things were back in order, in reality, Rome had decided to abandon the ambitious plan of annexing those Germanic territories into the empire permanently. The line of the Rhine River became the effective boundary of Roman rule. This was a strategic turning point. Augustus and Tiberius recognized that pushing further into Germany might cost too much for uncertain gain. These deep forests and fierce tribes might not be worth the blood and treasure after all. It wasn't an official surrender of claims, Romans seldom admitted defeat, but pragmatically they scaled back. However, a few years later, when Tiberius became emperor after Augustus's death in 14, his adopted son and actual nephew, Germanicus, was given command in the Rhine area. Germanicus was a young, energetic general, and he wanted to avenge the Varus disaster and restore Roman honor. Also, after Augustus's death, there was unrest among the legions on the Rhine. They even mutinied briefly, asking for better pay. Germanicus perhaps wanted to redirect their restless energy toward an external enemy to discipline them and satisfy their desire for action. So in the autumn of 14 and into 15 and 16, Germanicus launched a series of large-scale campaigns into Germania beyond the Rhine, essentially to punish the tribes and, if possible, retrieve the lost legionary standards, those eagle banners, and any survivors, he assembled a formidable force, possibly 8 legions, plus numerous auxiliaries and cavalry. This time they were far more careful, marching in well-ordered columns, guarding their flanks, building causeways over swamps ahead of time. Germanicus made sure to reconstruct those pontes longi, or long causeways, across the marshes so his heavy troops could move safely. In one of these expeditions, Germanicus made a poignant detour. He led his army to visit the site of the Teutoburg Forest battlefield, 6 years after the battle. He said, in a battle, the Roman soldiers as they approached found themselves walking in a landscape of ghostly memories. The accounts say they encountered heaps of bleached bones scattered over the fields and woods, skeletons of their fallen countrymen still lying where they had died, exposed to the elements and scavengers. They saw bits of Roman armor and weapons rusting in the ground, and they discovered tree trunks where skulls of Roman soldiers had been nailed in grim display. Imagine the chill that ran through those legionaries as they beheld this scene. Many of them probably had comrades or even family in Varus's legions. Tacitus tells us that even hardened Roman troops were moved to tears at the sight, as they gave these remains a proper burial at last. Germanicus himself helped in the burial rites, piling earth to create a tumulus, a burial mound, so that the lost legionaries would finally rest in peace and not lie unburied, which was a horrific fate in Roman eyes. While searching the battleground, Germanicus's men reportedly also found clear evidence of those sacrificial rituals we mentioned. Altars in groves on which they deduced that Roman officers had been slain, possibly charred remains or personal items indicated tribunes and centurions had been killed as offerings to the Germanic gods. There were indications of makeshift graves or pits where some bodies were disposed, and gibbets where some had been hung. The Roman soldiers, listening to local guides or a few surviving witnesses, learned exactly where certain events happened. Here Varus received his first wound. There stood Arminius when he addressed his warriors. Over yonder the eagles were taken. Here the first legion made its last stand, and so on. They even learned of Varus's fate, where he fell by his own hand. Such detailed, grim storytelling in that haunted place must have left a deep mark on them. Germanicus's campaigns led to a few Roman victories in the field, notably the Battle of Idestarviso by the Weser River in 16, where Germanicus's legions met Arminius's forces in open battle and defeated them, inflicting heavy casualties. Arminius was actually one of the few to escape that battle alive, albeit wounded or nearly captured. Germanicus also recovered 2 of the 3 lost eagles in these campaigns, one retrieved by a commander named Lucius Statinius from the Bructeri tribe's territory, that was the eagle of the 19th Legion, and another regained after defeating another group of Germans, the eagle of the 17th or 18th. The 3rd eagle would not be recovered until much later, in 41, under Emperor Claudius, when a Roman general negotiated or fought it out of a German tribe, the Chauci, who held it. Despite Germanicus's aggressiveness, even he couldn't permanently subdue the region. Each time the Romans would score a win, the Germanic warriors would retreat into the endless forest, avoiding decisive capture. And these campaigns were costly and logistically draining, as the land could hardly support large Roman armies for long. Eventually, Emperor Tiberius decided enough was enough. He had proven Rome could retaliate. Germanicus celebrated a triumph in Rome in the year 17 with prisoners and recovered standards, which soothed Roman pride. But Tiberius saw little sense in occupying Germania fully, so he recalled Germanicus, and from then on, Rome essentially conceded that the boundary would remain at the Rhine, with the exception of occasional raids or brief occupations. Arminius, the architect of Rome's worst defeat in that era, survived Rome's counteroffensive, but his story didn't end triumphantly either. After Germanicus withdrew, Arminius found himself embroiled in internal conflicts. The dream of a united, free Germania began to fracture. Old rivalries resurfaced. Arminius had become very powerful, and that made other tribal nobles wary. Within a few years, his own relatives turned on him. In around 10 years after Teutoburg, Arminius was assassinated by members of his extended family, possibly even by the instigation of his own father-in-law Segestes, or others who felt he was aiming to become a king over all, which the fiercely independent tribes could not tolerate. The liberator of Germania died not by a Roman sword, but by the treachery of his own people's politics, a fate not uncommon in tribal power struggles. The Germans never did unite into a single nation at that time. The Cherusci and others eventually fragmented, Rome's frontier stabilized, and they traded occasional skirmishes, but mostly an uneasy peace held for decades. The Rhine and the Danube became the well-defended borders of the Roman Empire for centuries to come. The significance of the Battle of Teutoburg Forest echoed throughout Roman history. It was the empire's greatest defeat on its northern frontier and taught them to respect the power of guerrilla warfare and the difficulty of conquering the dense wildlands of Germania. Legions X15, V48, and XX were never reformed. Their numbers retired like a sports jersey that's been taken out of circulation to honor those lost. In Roman literature and memory, Varus's loss became a byword for disaster. Emperors in the future, when embarking on risky campaigns, would be warned not to meet Varus's fate. Augustus's plaintive cry, "Give me back my legions," remained a famous anecdote illustrating the depth of his grief. On the Germanic side, the memory lived on more in folklore than in writing, since they didn't write histories at that time. But much later, during the Renaissance and especially in the 19th century, German nationalists revived the tale of Arminius, whom they called Hermann, a Germanization of his name, as a symbol of German unity and resistance to invaders. A massive monument stands today in the Teutoburg Forest area, the Hermannsdenkmal, erected in the 1800s, depicting Arminius victoriously with a sword as a romantic national hero. Of course, in reality, Arminius' victory was as much about cunning and exploiting Roman mistakes as any inherent superiority, but as time passed, legends tend to emphasize the heroic narrative. For us, resting here in the modern world, with our eyes closed, snug and safe, the story offers perspective. Why wouldn't we last a minute in that battle? Because the reality of ancient combat, and that brutal ambush in particular, is so far removed from our daily experience of comfort that it's almost unimaginable to truly endure it. Consider what these people went through. Days and nights of being cold and wet without relief. Imagine the feeling of marching hour after hour with water squelching in your boots, a heavy helmet constricting your vision, your shoulders raw from carrying a shield and pack. Add to that the mental strain. Any moment, death could come whistling silently from behind a tree in the form of a spear. The relentless uncertainty would break most of us. The Roman soldiers were tough, hardened by discipline and training and often previous wars. Even so, many of them succumbed to panic and despair under those conditions. Modern people, accustomed to far gentler environments and knowing that help is usually a phone call away, would find the sheer primal isolation of that situation terrifying. We live in a time of climate-controlled homes, soft beds, and quick transportation. Spend a minute in the Teutoburg Forest of Year 9, and you might already yearn for a dry blanket and a warm drink. Now put yourself in a soldier's sandal. You haven't been dry in days, you haven't had a hot meal, you're physically exhausted by marching and fighting. Emotionally, you're drained by seeing friends killed next to you, hearing screams in the darkness that you can do nothing about, feeling utterly lost in hostile territory. Fear is a constant companion, not a sharp adrenaline fear that passes, but a deep gnawing dread that each minute could be your last, and in such a lonely, far-off manner. In our modern imagination, war is often depicted with a degree of glamour, or at least clarity, heroes and villains, charges and retreats. But the truth, as seen in events like Teutoburg, is that war can be complete chaos, confusion and horror. There's no glory in dying anonymously in a muddy ravine, trampled by a panicked mule, or felled by a foe you never even saw. We might enjoy games or films where we fantasize about epic battles, but these are sanitized experiences behind a screen. In reality, the sensory onslaught alone, the cold biting your skin, the blaring noise, the stench of blood and sweat and fear would be overwhelming for most of us who have grown used to comfort. Those Roman legionaries, tough as they were, broke under those conditions after holding as long as humanly possible. Modern people, in comparison, would break much sooner. We often get flustered if we lose our phone signal or if the weather unexpectedly soaks us on the way to work. Those men endured an all-encompassing misery and mortal danger that we can scarcely replicate even in extreme training scenarios. Wouldn't last a minute is perhaps a bit tongue-in-cheek, but it rings true in spirit. It's hard to imagine any of us calmly lasting even a very short while in that environment without being utterly undone by the shock and stress. Think also of the psychological difference. The Romans and Germans in that battle grew up in a world where life was more fragile and violence more commonplace. Death, even violent death, was around them, whether in the form of animal attacks, accidents with primitive technology, or warfare which was frequent on the fringes. They had certain stoicism ingrained. Nowadays, most of us are shielded from death. Many have never seen a corpse except maybe at a funeral, much less the gore of a battlefield. One glimpse of those heaps of bodies and severed limbs would make many modern individuals faint or panic. The soldiers of the ancient world could stomach that a bit more because it was unfortunately part of their lived experience, or at least their cultural expectation. In reflecting on this calmly, it doesn't mean we are weaker or they were stronger in some absolute sense. It's just a product of environment and expectation. Humans can adapt to a great many hardships if they must, but since we have not had to adapt to those specific hardships, we would be caught utterly unprepared. Our unpreparedness is not just physical, not knowing how to wield a sword or carry a 60-pound pack for hours, but mental and emotional too. As we bring this long, gentle narration to a close, let's take stock of the lessons and echoes of Teutoburg. Well, in a broad historical sense, that battle halted Rome's expansion into northern Europe, shaping the future map of Europe. The peoples east of the Rhine remain culturally distinct from the Romanized west and south. Over time, those Germanic peoples would have their own great migrations and interactions with Rome, eventually even contributing to Rome's fall centuries later, but that moment in 9 saved them from being Latinized like Gaul was. If not for Arminius's ruse, perhaps Latin language and Roman law might have extended to the Elbe or beyond. Instead, a sort of line was drawn, and on either side of it, different histories unfolded. For the Romans, the shock made them more cautious at their limits. They learned respect for local conditions, an implicit realization that not everywhere could be made a Roman province easily. The empire turned its attentions elsewhere, and in a generation or two, Germany, beyond the Rhine, became known as a place where 3 legions lie buried, something to be approached carefully or not at all. And in memory, too, there is a haunting element. Imagine that dense forest, after everything, slowly reclaiming the site. Leaves falling each autumn to cover the bones, vines creeping over abandoned shields, seasons of rain washing the evidence into the soil. The locals might avoid the area, believing the spirits of the dead linger. Indeed, when Germanicus arrived years later, finding bones strewn about, some still impaled on tree branches or piled in makeshift piles, it was as if the forest had held on to that trauma, not letting it be forgotten. When we reflect on standing even a minute in that place, perhaps we feel a mixture of admiration and pity for those who did. Admiration, because they faced horrors we thankfully do not have to, and many fought bravely and endured as long as humanly possible. Pity, because so many of them were young men, far from home, who met a terrible end they likely couldn't fully comprehend until it was too late. And also empathy, because despite the gap of 2 millennia, they were human like us. They must have felt the same profound fear and longing for safety that any of us would. Now, as you relax, safe under your blankets, these scenes fade into the mists of time. The clashing of swords grows distant in your mind, replaced by the gentle patter of rain. Imagine it now as a soothing sound, not a frightening one. The cries and chaos give way to silence, the silence of acceptance and rest. The battle is long over. The forest eventually fell quiet, and in that quiet, perhaps a kind of peace. Picture the Teutoburg Forest today, tranquil, green and serene. Sunlight filters through trees onto mossy ground where once there was blood and thunder. Maybe you hear birds chirping softly, descendants of those that might have flown in terror during the fight, now singing peacefully as if to heal that memory. Tourists might walk through these woods on a calm afternoon, not feeling anything but curiosity and a slight solemnity. And a sunset, really. The land has absorbed the events and returned to calm, as nature always does. In your mind's eye, you stroll away from the scene, back to the edge of the woods. The visions of legionaries and warriors dissolve behind you. You're left with lessons, but also a reassuring thought that you are here, in the present, safe and sound. The past cannot hurt you, it can only teach and fascinate. The hardship of those times makes our present comfort all the more appreciable. Now you know why you, or I, or most anyone today, likely wouldn't last even a minute in that terrible ambush, not because of some failing, but because we live in a different world. And that's okay. We can be grateful that we do not have to face those trials. Instead, we honor those who did by remembering their stories softly, as we have done tonight. Feel the softness of your pillow, the warmth of your covers. These are your modern armor against the cold and dark. Much gentler and kinder than a Roman shield and mail. The battle we witnessed tonight is over, safely tucked away in history books and quiet recountings like this, to gently send us off to sleep with perspective in our hearts. Take a slow, deep breath, in and out. Let any remaining tension in your body sink away, as if it were those heavy pieces of armor being set down. You are not marching, you are lying comfortably. There is no rain soaking you, if you listen. Perhaps only the hush of your room, or maybe the soft hum of nighttime outside. You might even imagine a light patter of rain on your window. But that sound is soothing now, a lullaby of nature, because you are dry and warm, unlike those poor souls we talked about. Close your eyes if they aren't closed already, and imagine one more scene. The Teutoburg Forest under a gentle dawn, many days later, empty of people, just nature. A light mist rises from the damp earth, curling around tree trunks. The sunlight breaks through in shafts. All is quiet except for the drip of water from leaves. In that calm, one could almost sense a sigh of relief from the earth. The violence has passed. Those ancient trees, which saw such fear and fury, now stand silently as witnesses to time, offering a sanctuary to animals and eventually to new generations of humans who come in peace. And perhaps think, too, of how far we have come. While conflict and hardship have by no means vanished from our world, many of us at least do not have to know the kind of raw brutality that was common back then. In a way, remembering such events with empathy might make us more appreciative, more gentle with each other. It might remind us that war is no adventure or game, but a source of immense suffering, something humanity strives to rise above. As you drift towards sleep, let these thoughts and images float away like leaves on a stream. Replace them with a focus on your own breathing and the safety of your bed. The story we travel through tonight stays behind in the pages of history. You carried through it bravely with your imagination, and now you deserve rest, far from any battles, in the peace of your own room. Feel your body relaxing further, from your toes to the top of your head. Any weight or tightness left is melting away. You might feel gratitude for the softness of the present moment, for the fact that you are alive in a time where you can learn about such past struggles without having to experience them. In your mind, say a quiet good night to those restless spirits of the forest, the soldiers, the warriors, all who fell. Wish them peace. They have told their tale, and they fade back into the mist. Here now, it's just you, in a safe place, your heart rate slow and calm, your breathing gentle. Perhaps you can even imagine that a friendly voice, maybe a gentle narrator or a loved one, is sitting by your side, keeping watch so you can sleep without worry. You are as safe now as those legionaries wished they could be on those scary nights. There are no ambushes in your room, only soft pillows and the quiet night. The long journey through history is over, and you can let yourself sink into the warm embrace of sleep. Time for rest, dear friend. You've listened so patiently, walked so far in imagination. Now there is nothing more to do, except to let go and float into dreams. Perhaps dreams of tranquil forests, but lit with sunlight and laughter instead of storm and strife. Feel yourself drifting, as if on a small boat on a calm river, a river that carries you away from the battlefield and towards a sunny, open land of peace and slumber. The water is gentle, rocking you softly. The sky above is clear. You are content, your mind at ease. Tonight you learned about why you wouldn't last a minute in the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, but you also learned you don't have to. Others faced those dark minutes so that eventually the world could move on. We remember them, and we let that memory remind us to cherish our minutes of comfort. So now, sleep. Let the quiet of the night enfold you, like the safe walls of a fortress that no enemy can breach. Let each breath you exhale carry away any lingering tension, and each breath you inhale fill you with calm. Good night, sleep tight, and may you have peaceful dreams. You are safe, you are warm, and you are loved. Until next time, rest well.